sure. So basically, it's a very similar situation to what happened to the United States and the global economy in the late 1960s and through the 1970s. And that is that inflationary momentum in the economy, once it gathers pace, defeating the inflation requires such a level of economic pain that it becomes politically unfeasible to do.
Right.
And the Federal Reserve is independent, right? In that it's as independent as the political establishment allows it to be at any given time. And definitely steps have been taken that changed it to a certain extent since the 1970s. So it's not quite as susceptible to political capture as it was in 1970 when Richard Nixon named Arthur Burns as the chairman, and he was Arthur Burns. It was later discovered when all the Nixon tapes were released. In a recent series of notes, I listened to a lot of the tapes, and Nixon had the Secret Service put microphones in his desk. And so there's a lot of creaking. You're always hearing as they're shifting around and everything. But these conversations were all taking place, and Nixon knew it, but nobody else did. One of his aides did. And he relied very heavily on Arthur Burns, who was the chairman of the Fed, as a political advisor and as his economic hitman to make sure that monetary policy didn't tighten. And he sent a confidential letter, which was later released in the Watergate trial, to Arthur Burns in late 1971 in the lead up to the 1972 election. It said that inflation, people don't like it, but it doesn't matter for voting. That what really matters is unemployment. And he very much blamed the head of the chairman of the Fed in 1960 for his loss then against John F. Kennedy. And he was very, very heavily pressuring Arthur Burns, do not raise interest rates before April because of 1972. And Arthur Burns carried that into the Fed meetings, right? And part of the relationship between the two was picking people that Arthur knew he could pressure and that would do what he wanted, right? And he even had the FBI investigate leaks by one of the governors who wouldn't just do what he wanted. And so this carried on through the 1970s. So, after Nixon, Burns was able to be a little tighter, right? Because you had Gerald Ford, who was sort of a weak president because he was not elected. He was just named, and he had been the House Majority Leader. And so he ran things like a congressman, not as a president, right? And so he kind of let people do things. If it wasn't, he didn't want to hear about things unless he needed to. So Arthur Burns ran things tighter, right? But it wasn't ever quite enough to defeat the inflation. And as soon as Jimmy Carter came in, right, he said, give me easier money. I want easy money. And Arthur Burns said, well, he was a very dedicated Republican. He wasn't interested in helping Jimmy Carter. And so as soon as Jimmy Carter could get rid of him, he did. And he put in a guy, William Miller, who was the CEO of a company and a very progressive businessman. And he believed that raising it, he was kind of like Erdogan. He believed that raising interest rates could be inflationary, and had this whole crazy idea. Yeah, and so the result was pretty much exactly the same. Was a nasty inflationary mess, and there was a fight between the political loyalists of the Carter administration, including the chairman of the Fed, and the Treasury Secretary, who was saying this is crazy. We need to raise interest rates. So Jimmy Carter fired his Treasury Secretary, put the chairman of the Fed in the Treasury Secretary position because he trusted him. And almost by accident, it ended up that Paul Volcker came in. And Paul Volcker started his tightening, but didn't really achieve it until you had Ronald Reagan, who Paul Volcker hated. So he was perfectly happy to raise interest rates, and did, but actually didn't. That's the amazing thing, is that there's a debate over how disingenuous the monetary targeting was. So in 1979, they started this process because they had been ordered by Congress to reduce the growth rate of money. So to start targeting the money supply in some way. And they had started this process, but really jumped into it when they had no other choice in October of 1979, when inflation expectations started going through the roof and you had the oil embargo. And they switched over to targeting reserves, and it's, depending on how cynical you are, you can look at it as either they did this such that they wouldn't have to set interest rates at 20%. They could just say, well, the interest rates are 20%, and that's what it is. We didn't do it. The bank's demand for money did. Or you could say that they didn't know how high it could go and wanted to just let the market set it, right? And it was high. They did say subsequently it was higher than they expected it to. They never expected interest rates to go to 20%, right? And it's debatable whether, and so there's whether they didn't think it, and the market showed them the actual price, or whether they suspected that it might need to go that high and didn't have the political will to do it, right? Either way, that's how it ended up happening, and it didn't really work. They didn't go all in until there was a president that the chairman of the Fed didn't mind if he got fired. Volcker had a long career working in various parts of government. He was like, whatever, if Reagan doesn't want me, he can fire me. That's fine. And I'll raise interest rates. And so we have definitely entered that period. And what accelerated it, right, in the the COVID thing everybody knows about, but in the United States, the political changes that allowed it to happen was the Biden administration's coup over the Federal Reserve Board in 2022, right? So because of trading activity, right, that was not reported and that was in the past overlooked, 3 of the Fed governors were pressured into resigning, right? So Biden got to name 3 governors in his first year, right? Which normally would take 6 years to get to if everyone were to, all the terms were to, right? So that means, and one of the governors that Trump named is a PhD economist who's a pretty easy money guy. So that means that 4 of the 7 board members, right, not including the chairman, are pretty easy money people, and one of them is definitely easy money person, and 3 of them are directly loyal to Biden because he gave them the job. So Powell is getting pressured by these people, and we are entering an election year, right? They are going to want to cut interest rates to help out Joe Biden.
Just to throw this in, we are recording this end of June 2023. And right now, there are quite a few dovish comments, I would say, or like a lot of market participants would expect, inflation to slow down. There are a couple of hiccups sometimes, like recently there was UK inflation data released, but like overall, I think the expectation is quite clear at this point.